Okay, welcome to the first of Godalming College's AQA Computer Science NE Enlightenment sessions, and we're going to look today at analysis. I'm going to create 3 videos for analysis, and this first one is particularly looking at the research you should do. Coming soon, we'll be looking at the formal analysis techniques and crucially the requirements. I'm hoping to create a set of videos that will sort of support and underpin the techniques behind everything you should do on your NEA. The reason why I'm doing this is because it's really obvious now that you guys are coming through, and at GCSE you don't do any sort of formal coursework anymore. All of the NEAs that you do previously are effectively controlled assessments and very much in the classroom. This of course is being done predominantly outside of the classroom and in your own time. So with each of the videos I'm always going to start with the mark scheme. And it's really, I'm not going to read it out to you, but it's really, really important that you realise that pretty much all of the advice that I give you is because we're trying to find ways to help you communicate the work you've done in a way that will show competence against this mark scheme. So, some things you do for your NEA are purely to get marks, if we're going to be honest. Some things you're doing to help you better understand your problem and to better to create a better system, because ultimately the most marks in your NEA are for creating a solution, a programmed solution that will work. So sometimes you're doing things to be able to create that better solution. Sometimes you're doing it because you need to get some marks, and sometimes you're doing it because you need to better communicate to a reader what's going on. And a nice background to a problem, I think, covers all 3. And I'm not being cynical when I say to get marks. Sometimes later on in life you're going to have to create reports and you're going to have to document work that you've done, and you've got to remember that often when you're doing that work you're doing it for multiple different readers, and you're presenting that work for multiple different reasons. So it's not cynical, this is a professional way of working. So for your NEA, please make sure you've got a really clear background to the problem. And as part of that, you've got to have a clearly identified third party. Now, if it's an end user problem you're making, it's easy, because if you've got somebody who needs a specialist booking system, then the person who needs that system is your third party. It's a little bit trickier if you're an investigation, and it might be a little bit contrived. So it might be that it's a teacher or a friend of the family who has some expertise, but it's someone who you can have a meaningful dialogue with about your investigation. Officially, it's somebody who wants something investigating, but they might want it investigating because you've kind of said, I want to do this investigation, but it has to be someone you can have a meaningful dialogue with. Every project, whether it's a third-party end-user project or whether it is an investigation, needs to have a third party that you identify in the background. I'm going to just pull in at this stage a project. Whoops. Let me just try and. There we go. A project that was created a few years ago by one of my students, and this project is all about creating a system that would manage the badge program in Cubs, Scouts and Beavers. So now actually the Scout Association has a piece of software that does this, but this was before then. And as you can see, the very first thing he's done is given a bit of blurb. He has not assumed that people know what Cubs or Scouts are. He's literally explained what Cubs and Scouts are. He's given a background to the particular Scout group he goes to, and he said that where you can get information from. and I'll come back to the rest of it in a moment. But hopefully that's given you a little flavour for what the background should include. Now, you may have noticed in the mark scheme it uses a phrase called fully scoped. So if you've got a scope, that's a range of things. To be fully scoped, you've covered the full range of information about your project. So your research has got to cover everything about the thing that you're investigating, or everything about the problem that you're trying to solve. And we're going to give you a few research techniques that will, if you do them fairly thoroughly, I think will be reasonable to call it fully scoped. So the idea that you wouldn't talk to your third party in order to find out what they want is bonkers. So the idea that you can have an interview and that you're going to document that is important. If you've got multiple end users, or there are lots of people that are going to be affected by the system, or there are lots of people that have experienced the thing you're investigating. So a classic investigation is some form of game. So you could survey a dozen people who play this game. So let's say it's chess or noughts and crosses, whatever it happens to be, Connect 4. You could ask them if they're playing, what do they want? So there could be multiple users. If you've got a booking system, you've got the main person who actually controls the ticket booking, if you like, but you've also got all the people who do the booking, who actually book or cars into a garage or whatever the end user system has to be. At the very least, you ought to consider surveying them. Okay. Document capture. Regardless of whether it's an investigation or end user, there will be data involved. Now, this document capture might literally be like a booking sheet, or it might be, as with the Scout project, it might be, oops, that's the wrong thing. It might be, here we go. Sorry about that. It might be literally photos or scans of documents. Okay. Oh my word, what's going on? Sorry about that. My laptop's done a Windows update and seems to be lagging. So it could be literally a document, or it could, of course, be something that, like, I don't know, if you've got Connect 4, the idea that you do a photo of the board so you can see how it works, or it could be how you score points on a particular other game. You've got to effectively capture evidence of the data that's going to be processed. Clearly, if you've got any data protection issues, just blank out the information and put representative data. So if it's a name, feel free to put Bob the Builder and make up an age and make up an address. That's absolutely fine, as long as it's representative data. I think observation for all is really, really useful, because it makes it really easy for you to sort of very, very quickly sort of summarize and note processes involved. So effectively, this finds out what someone wants. This allows you to really see the data that's involved in your system, and this helps you to really see the process involved. If you're doing investigations, or you're doing an end user project that's going to have a several different solutions that might be sort of very similar to classic computer science algorithms, it would be interesting for you to do a bit of reading around some of these algorithms so you can best judge. So if you're going to do a little 3-lane neural net, or you're going to use a minimax, or you're going to use an A-star, or you get the idea. Any of the a classic algorithm, then really sort of a bit of a reading review to say, oh, I looked at this, I looked at that, I looked at the other. It's a good place to put it into your research because it helps you refer to it later on. So documentation. Always just give a tiny bit of blurb so the reader knows what's going on. It's a real faux pas of computer science students in particular, I think, just to dump a figure or a graph or a transcript and expect people to understand where it's come from. Just even if it's just a few lines so that we know to give some context to what you're showing. Obviously, you're going to list the questions. That's an essential. I used to really insist on a full transcript. I've softened it. I think a transcript's lovely, but I think at the very least, a list of questions and then a summary of an answer that the person's made is absolutely essential. The AQA did produce, it was actually for the last spec, but if you look on line, particularly Godalming Online, if you're a Godalming student, there is a worksheet that again was officially AQA produced for the last specification, but I think it's still pretty useful and it helps you structure your questions for the worksheet. If I cut to back to this scouting project, then you can see that the student here did create an interview and actually had specific questions and put a full transcript of the answers given. It was pretty thorough. So where are we? Yep. I forget what the color coding was actually, but I don't think he explained what the color coding was for. But effectively, is kind of written questions, put a bit of blurbage about the background to the question, then put the transcript, and I forget what the final bit, these bits were for. But anyway, effectively, you can see its question and some details. Let's kill that. For a questionnaire, again, just make sure you clearly show where you got it from. Again, the list of questions, and I think you don't need to give detailed responses, just graphs, charts. If you've got written checks, just list the highlights really. And crucially, I think with something like a questionnaire, you need to sort of summarize it to show what your understanding of the findings are. Document capture, this starts to get a bit more interesting. I think you need to create a list of the documents and just clearly show. It can be photos, it can be scans, and ideally what you want is something that clearly shows the overall format of whatever you're trying to put in, and also if you have to do a zoom in so it clearly shows the particular data sets involved, do it. It doesn't matter if you repeat things a couple of times in order to make sure it's clear. Feel free to put a few little notes on this, but you're going to be doing a formal technique called a document specification sheet or a data dictionary later on. But make sure you've looked at that so you know the sort of information you need to keep about each document. I think in terms of document capture, sort of scanning bits of books or screenshotting certain elements from websites is absolutely fine. Need to be a bit careful about copyright, but obviously because it's educational usage, as long as you're not doing too much, you are probably covered. Finally, observation. There's not much you can do here really other than just write down, again, a little bit of background and crucially what you saw. Try and make sure that you don't spend ages describing useless guff and then skim over the really useful bits. What you're really keen on is sort describing the process. So a team picking system is quite popular with A-level students. So the idea that you would really sort of describe how someone had 3 sheets of paper and was using a tally chart so they could sort of see how many games a particular person, a team has played, and has got various sort of notes how well that they have worked in training or whatever, and then how that they actually filled the number of slots in the team and the number of subs if it's football to create the team. And you could sort of ask questions like, why, how are you choosing that name? And make sure you expand on that, because what you're trying to do is really clearly show how the current system works. If you're doing investigation, like Connect 4, the idea that you would get people to play a game of Connect 4 in the real world and for you to note down key parts of the process. This is a little bit contrived, but actually will be quite useful. For you can say, clearly I can see there's a strategy. If someone spots us 3 in a row, they always try and block it. I mean, that's a facile example, but it's actually something that would be a useful thing for you to observe to talk about the gameplay. I mentioned reading reviews, and hopefully this is clear enough. This is actually something, if anyone's done an extended project, they'll have seen, or if they've done a dissertation style piece of work. But it is really useful for you to create a bibliography. If you've got a book, make sure you note down the ISBN, the title and the author, and just a little bit of blurb, just to partly remind you and partly to help a third-party reader see where you've got information and what information you've used and how it's helped influence you. I'll be encouraging you to reference other things later on because that'll save you from getting caught into any plagiarism problems. But this is, I think it's useful for you, and it's useful for a reader to see where you've got your information from, because later on, if you've just sort of magically pulled algorithms out of thin air and people are really trying to struggle to see how you've got to that algorithm, going back and saying, okay, I can see they've read this book, I can see they've read this book, this is probably where they've got their ideas from, and that is perfectly acceptable. So some of you might choose to do investigation that seems very abstract, and you don't seem to be able to classically get those areas of research. However, there needs to be clearly documented research. I have had a few people that have done, say, physics simulations, and the vast majority of their research has been mathematical, okay? And they have documented different algorithms, and they've documented different data elements, effectively based on what they have worked out their ultimate system will need. As long as you can show how you have worked out what input, process, storage and outputs your solution is going to need, and you've got a sort of research base that shows that shows that you've done some research. I mean, there's no way you're working this stuff out from first principles in your own head. You must be looking something up to try and work out what to create. If you've got something really awkward, there should be some interesting maths or some other solutions that solve similar problems out there, and you need to be having a look at those. If at this stage you're thinking, well, there really isn't anything to research, then you need to speak to your teachers, need to speak to myself or Phil if you're at Godalming straight away, because if you're in that situation, it might be your project isn't a viable project. So hopefully you now know that what you need to show, that you've got to basically document that you know all there is to know about your current system, that it's really clear that you've had thorough research, and hopefully this means that you've got lots and lots of information that you will then be able to apply formal techniques to, so that you better understand what your coded solution is going to require. and you'll be able to create this list of requirements that is really high quality and makes your coded solution far more relevant and far more easy to actually produce. Because that list of requirements is genuinely fundamental. It's fundamental to any coded solution, and it's really fundamental to you getting high marks in your NEA. I hope that you found that useful. There is a few other things floating about. AQA, AQA used to produce a checklist. This is for the old Comp 4, this is a previous spec. It's not as relevant now, but I think it's quite a nice little aid memoir for you to have a look at. Quite a lot of these things are we're going to look at in the formal techniques, but as you can see, in the old system you used to be asked to identify background. Make sure you had a description, make sure you identified users. So you should still be able to get hold of that from somewhere, and I hope that is everything you need to know about research. Feel free to ask questions in the comments, or of course if you're in one of my classes, ask me.